And we are live.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's the one and only V, the Gorilla Economist, coming to you live with my main man, Harley Schlanger. Harley's here, folks, and he is here to lend a voice of sensibility, clarity, and credence to what is really going on in the world. The world's on the brink. We're hearing of wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations and kingdom against kingdoms. But let not your heart be troubled. Harley is here to spell it out all for us. And without further ado, Harley, how are you, sir?
I'm not sure I can quite ease all the fears of wars and empires and things of that sort, but at least we can make sense of what we're facing and maybe move in the right direction to stop it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Harley, where do you want to start with this week's ball of yarn? We have everything from synagogue slaughters to caravans to MAGA bombers. I mean, where do we begin?
Well, those three things are all part of what I call Operation Chaos.
Yes.
The Mueller-Russiagate investigation is a spectacular flop because it never was true in the first place. And the various indictments and plea bargainings were fraudulent to begin with. And we see in the Papadopoulos case may be reversed very dramatically as Papadopoulos is preparing to expose the full British coordination with the FBI and the CIA. So the Mueller situation failed. The media attacks on Trump, constant attacks, have had an effect on some people. I think some independents and moderates are just bombarded and don't know how to react. But on the other hand, Trump supporters have been hardened in their commitment to stand behind the president.
Yes.
And Trump's very effective deployment around the Kavanaugh case forced most Republicans to support him. So we're coming up to the midterm elections where it's a crapshoot. No one knows what's going to happen, who's going to turn out. The polls are volatile. Everyone was hyping this poll yesterday, an NBC poll that showed Trump had dropped 4 points in the last 2 days. Well, the week before he went up 4 points. The polls are very volatile. They represent a manipulation factor, but that's why Operation Chaos is being unleashed. And you have this obvious mental case in Florida, but someone who, the fact that he's sending out fake pipe bombs in itself is interesting because and who he's sending them to shows that they're trying to make it look as though Donald Trump called him up and said, here's who to target. Then the attack on the synagogue, plays into the deepest fears around polarization, that you have anti-Hispanic with the caravan, you have anti-black racism from Trump, according to the media, because his opposition to Black Lives Matters and his talk about nationalism. And now we have anti-Semitism, which they're trying to pin on Trump, when this guy himself looks very suspiciously like someone else who was triggered by an FBI psychological warfare operation. So, the intent is to polarize, to blame Trump for the polarization, and then try to use that to dampen the enthusiasm for the turnout next Tuesday so that the Democrats can get enough votes that they can take over the House. Yeah. So I think that's what we're seeing. And I just want to emphasize, the more that we focus on the British role in Russiagate, the better effect we have toward wiping it out. Because it's not just Brennan. Brennan's an evil character. Clapper's an evil character. Hillary Clinton, we know who she is. With Halloween coming up, watch her in the skies over the next night or two.
I definitely am.
and keep an eye open because you don't want that flying in your window. But with all that said, the impetus for this comes from the military networks of British intelligence, the NATO operation, and the special forces operation with the CIA in the United States. The FBI is playing a role largely at the top through the Comey, McCabe, Peter Strzok, these kinds of networks. But it's a British operation. And when Trump moved to declassify the documents, the Brits freaked out. Now, some people are asking, why is Trump letting these documents just sit there? And I think, he had a meeting with Rosenstein, and the report I'm getting is that Trump basically laid out to Rosenstein what he's going to do, which is after the election, either Rosenstein's going to dismiss Mueller or Trump will dismiss Rosenstein. And the whole operation is going to be smashed. So I think that what people should realize is that the more exposure on these networks there is, and also exposure of why they're doing it, their fear that Trump is going to break the old paradigm. That's the key issue. Now, on that look, there's a lot of positive news. Trump is going to be meeting with Putin in 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. He's going to be meeting with Xi, the president of China. And in one of his campaign events the other day, he said some really interesting things. He said, look, we're having a tough time with Russia and China now on the surface, but I have good relations with Putin and Xi. My meeting in Helsinki was excellent. Xi and I have very strong relationship, good charisma between us, or good chemistry between us. And he said, we'll work these things out. Now, that's what the establishment is terrified about. And I'll point out one other thing to people who say, why does Trump have all these neocons and rotten networks in his administration like Bolton? Trump lets Bolton shoot off his mouth as much as he wants. But when Bolton goes to Russia, Bolton is on Trump's policy. And what Trump is trying to do with the INF is to get a new agreement. He's not planning on throwing it all out, but he's moving toward a new agreement, which could include China. So
that is good to know.
Yeah. Now, we'll see whether it fully materializes or not is hard to say. Now, the other thing that's really positive is what happened in the Hessen elections. Hessen is a state in Germany, with Wiesbaden, that's next to Frankfurt. Americans know it because that's where the Hessians, the mercenaries, came from who were hired by the British to fight us in the American Revolution. The election there was another catastrophic defeat for the Merkel coalition. The CDU had a low total, somewhere in the 26 or so percent. The Social Democrats lost 11% from the last vote in Hessen. They're practically a non-entity right now, even though they're a coalition partner. And Merkel, in response to that, stepped down as the chairman of the Christian Democrats, a position which she has held for 18 years. Now she's saying she's going to stay on as chancellor until her term ends in 2021. However, there's a grouping within the CDU that wants to get rid of her, her party, the Christian Democrats, a grouping with their sister partner, the Christian Social Union, that wants to get rid of her. And there's a call possibly for new elections, in which case she would be out. So the German situation is highly unstable right now in a good way, because Merkel's policies were the policies of the British and the deep state in the United States. Then you have Italy and Austria aggressively mobilizing. You had a meeting last week of Macron and Merkel with Erdogan and Putin, which, there were no, I would say, no outstanding immediate results. However, the fact that it took place sent a message to the world that if anyone in Europe wants to be a factor in the Middle East, they have to go through Russia and Turkey. So the situation is shifting dramatically. And at this point, Trump is sending a middle finger to the media. And I think his visit to Pittsburgh, while there will be polarization around it, the polarization is coming from his opponents. He's going there with a message of healing, no extremism, no racism. And what are they saying? Well, we don't want you. As though Trump were the one who actually pulled the trigger at the synagogue. So I think people should be stout of heart, bold and aggressive, and assert that we're going to move into a new paradigm after the election next Tuesday, regardless of what the turnout is. If the Democrats take the House, so be it. Trump will still have the Senate, and he's going to fight like hell to do what he intends to do without feeling obligated to kiss the rear end of Nancy Pelosi.
That's good news. Harley, what do you see, especially with the situation in the Middle East, and how are things progressing over there?
Well, let me mention one other thing from Asia before I get to the Middle East. What Trump said about North Korea in his last two campaign events was fascinating. He said, look, the solution for North Korea, transportation, a transit center working with Japan, China, and South Korea. So that's what Obama had always opposed. That's what the Bush crowd opposed. That's what the Clapper and foreign affairs crowd, they wanted to keep North Korea in a state of war with the United States. And Trump's solution is what? Work with China, work with the new Silk Road policy. Now, in the Middle East, look, everything's up for grabs there. I think one of the reasons Trump is continuing to try to hold things together with Saudi Arabia is that the Khashoggi murder really puts a spotlight on Kushner, because he had been the main advocate in the administration for Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the would-be king of Saudi Arabia. Now, the broader picture here is there's the old relationships are breaking apart. Trump is trying to end the Saudi attempt to isolate Qatar, and he's working with Putin on that. And the Trump administration officials are telling the Saudis, look, the war in Yemen has to stop. So if you get some of these things done, and in that context, have a European support for the Russian initiative, the Russian-China initiative to rebuild Syria, then you have a potential for peace. And Putin was very clear on this after the meeting with Macron, Merkel, and Erdogan. He said, there will be a unified Syria under Assad. The Syrian people will determine if there's going to be any change in government, not foreign powers. And the Russians will continue to work with Syria to wipe out the terrorists. And we hope the United States will continue to coordinate with us to do that. Now, that's sending a message to Trump that Putin is not going to put up with this CIA operation around the oil fields in Syria, or around the continued support. You know, the CIA is trying to protect their assets, namely ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And if Trump gives the military, the U.S. military, the word, no more weapons, no more support, and don't protect them and don't evacuate them, let the Russians hit them, then the Syrian situation could be cleaned up in less than 6 months.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Absolutely. Switching gears, the situation also with Asia, we see that Japan is bond dumping. There's a lot of de-dollarizing going on in that area, in that region. Japan, China. China's really upset about what's happening at the Strait of Taiwan. They're strengthening military in the Strait of Taiwan, as well as the South China Seas as well. What's your take on that, Harley?
Well, the most important thing is that there was just a 3-day meeting with Abe in China, the Japanese prime minister, including meetings with Xi Jinping. And they went from talking about non-aggression to collaboration. And this is not just on the Korean Peninsula, but in resolving the issue of the South China Sea, the instability that is largely a result of neocon funny business around Taiwan. Now, again, what we see with China has been an exacerbation of tensions over the trade issue. And, you know, it's kind of interesting. We've now had the beginnings of these tariffs, and what's been the effect on trade? The trade deficit has gone up, because it's not China's fault that the U.S. has a trade deficit with China. It's the fault of the free trade agreements that were signed under Bush and Obama, the fault of the World Trade Organization policies. And as Trump said, again, I bring up this speech he made, I believe it was in Iowa, where he said, look, China's a victim of these policies also. So we've got to make it clear that we're going to work this out for ourselves and them. Now, in that context, what's the trump card, so to speak, that the Chinese have? Well, it's that they're aggressively building a new potential financial system. They're not doing it because they want to sink the US dollar and sink the US because they have too much invested in the dollar. They'd rather have the US work with them. But they're making it clear, including in negotiations and operations with Russia that include gold, that include the oil trade. Iran is a part of this. India is now a part of it. They're sending back a message, which is that the old threats of military activity from the West to hem them in will not work. And I'll just point out a very fascinating development in the last 24 hours. The president of Nigeria, who's undergoing somewhat of a destabilization because of his successful campaign against Boko Haram, he's carrying out an anti-corruption policy. But most importantly, he's working with the Italian government, with the Lake Chad Basin Commission, and with China for the most massive water project in world history, the replenishment of the Lake Chad Basin with water from the Congo River, which would stop mass migration from Africa into Europe. And he just came out and thanked the Chinese and said, we're going to pursue this. And he said, we'd like the US to be a part of this. We'd like the Europeans to join us, but we're going to do it with China and Italy regardless. And this is the new attitude in the world, in places like Africa, places like Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is under attack. Why? Because they're working with China. And the president of Sri Lanka said, well, unless you're going to come in here and build up our ports, we're going to work with China. In Central America, the Dominican Republic just signed a major agreement that essentially makes them a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And my good friend, who is a candidate for Congress in Houston, Texas, Keisha Rogers, and by the way, any Rogue Money listeners who have either live in the 9th District in Texas or have friends who do, there's an independent candidate, Keisha Rogers, who has won several Democratic primaries in the past and left the Democratic Party for the obvious reasons. She's running against Al Green, the impeachment candidate, the congressman from Houston. So tell people to go out and vote for the independent. Don't vote straight party ticket in Texas. You have to vote independent for Keisha. But anyway, she has an idea to change NAFTA, including the new agreement from Trump, to make it bigger and have it be the North American Belt and Road Initiative that would link up with China, what China is doing now in Central America, which would deal with this caravan problem. If you start, some people are afraid if you build high-speed rail, there'll be bigger, faster caravans. Nonsense. The people on the caravans will end up building the new highways, building the new cities in Honduras and the Dominican Republic, and they'll be locking up the Soros operatives, who are the ones who are taking these poor, desperate people and promising them money if they go to the United States. So again, we have two clear alternatives. You have on the one side the impeachment crowd, the British crowd, the Soros crowd, doing everything they can to disrupt the midterm elections and bring about a Democratic majority. And then you have global solutions, which Trump, as an American nationalist, can plug the United States into, and that would guarantee that these solutions would work. Without the United States, some of these things are going to be very difficult. And if the United States is brought under a Hillary regime in which it opposes China and opposes Russia, we'll have World War III in a minute. But if we can defeat the coup and provide the room for Trump to move ahead with some of these policies that he's supported in spite of the attacks, then we can turn it around. So this is not a cheerleading or a rah-rah thing. I agree with you completely. We could very easily end up in a situation where if the Democrats have a big victory next Tuesday, that they'll go for impeachment in the House, and they may even get some of these gutless, swinish Republicans who were part of the old Bush crowd in the Senate to go along with convicting Trump and running him out of office, and then we're headed toward World War III. So we've got to make this stand next week. And people should, if you don't like the Republicans, fine, hold your nose and vote Republican, because we've got to whip the Republican Party into shape, not because we're Republicans, but because we're opposed to the coup that's being run by the British and the Hillary Clinton Obama crowd.
Right. Absolutely.
One final point. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was just in Moscow for the first time in a few years and spoke at a number of conferences. She was given very extensive coverage in the Russian press and also the Chinese press. And her message was precisely this: if the coup can be defeated in the United States, then the potential for a Russia, U.S., China, India cooperation, a new financial system not based on central banks and private banks and financial swindles, but based on investment in physical economy, that's the potential. And she was very well received in these presentations.
That's fantastic, and that's good to know. And let's all hope. And that's why it's very important to come to this midterm election, folks. You got to get out there. You got to vote. You got to make it happen, because we got to stop this, because we are in literally the fight of our lives. Absolutely. Harley Schlanger. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
V, just the final point on this is that, for those people who think I'm a huge Trump supporter, I'm supporting him in his fight against the deep state and against the Clinton, Obama, Bush policies. And rather than sit back and criticize him when he does something wrong, get in there and fight to make sure that the coup faction is defeated. And then we can work on solving these other problems. But if this coup faction succeeds, our country is finished. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Harley Schlanger, thank you so much for being on. Folks, again, check out Harley's work over at theschillerinstitute.org as well as LaRouchePack.com. With that being said, CJ, take it away.